All right. Well, welcome everybody. Good evening. Thank you for joining us today in this webinar included in our Kitchell lecture series of architecture and design. My name is Sylvia Prairie. I'm the curator of the Architecture and Design collection at the Art, Design and Architecture Museum of UC Santa Barbara. It is a pleasure to introduce this lecture with Raymond Neutra, the architect Raymond Richard Neutra's youngest son. Thank you, Dr. Neutra, for accepting our invitation to give this talk tonight. The lecture is titled Cheap and Thin, Neutra and Lloyd Wright, and is derived from the book of the same title penned by Dr. Neutra. This event is organized in conjunction with the exhibition From Ricks to Neutra and Niemeyer, Tremaine Houses, 1936-1977, currently on view at the ADNA Museum. Please come visit. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I would like to acknowledge the fact that the wonderful site where our university is located is Chumash land. And in this regard, I would like to pay my respects to the Chumash peoples, their elders, past and present, and future generations. During his lecture tonight, Dr. Neutra will trace the 40-year relationship between his parents and Lloyd Wright, all while in considering the peculiar way in which the master from Wisconsin influenced the Viennese. In this regard, Dr. Neutra posits that Richard Neutra's architecture can be seen as an extension and adaptation of the 8 points that Wright made in his famous Wasmuth Portfolio. Published in Germany in 1911, the portfolio included 100 lithographs of line drawings, perspectives, and plans of buildings designed by Wright between 1893 and 1909. Dr. Neutra was highly influenced by his father's thought of the architectural practice as analogous to that of medicine, and her mother's sense of social justice and defense of liberal causes. Therefore, he decided to pursue a career in environmental medicine and epidemiology, a career which shares with architecture its social concern. For 27 years, Dr. Neutra was chief of the Division of Environmental and Occupational Disease Control of the California Department of Public Health. Dr. Neutra has served in the Scientific Advisory Board of the National Institute of Health and the World Health Organization. Today, Dr. Neutra leads the board of directors of the Neutra Institute for Survival Through Design, which pursues the preservation and use of the Neutra legacy to promote creative research and design that benefits people and the planet. Dr. Neutra's lecture will last around 40 to 45 minutes, after which we will have around 15 minutes for Q&A. I encourage all of you to use the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your screens for any questions for Dr. Neutra. We will address them with him at the end of this presentation. Thank you all for your presence here tonight and for your participation. On to you, Dr. Neutra. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So indeed, wait a second, we need to move this here. I take the title from the book, which is available to you as an ebook or soon as a hard copy at Amazon. And it relates to Wright's description of the Lovell Health House in 1932 when it was featured at the Museum of Modern Art exhibition on the international style. Cheap and thin. And in some ways, he was onto something because my father was trying to be economic with prefabrication and light with prefabrication. The points I will be making is what were the modernists, including Wright, rebelling against? What were the 8 points that he exemplified in the Wasmuth and Kahn lectures? How Schindler extended Wright's idea to the open plan, including a functional outdoors, the accomplishments of my father in his first 7 years in the United States, and why he wanted to be cheap and thin, how he was reinvigorated by the Dutch Wright enthusiasts on his 1930 visit, and then we'll go through how Neutra adopts and modifies Wright's 8 points. We'll ask about the change of materiality in the mid-30s, the influence of the Usonian houses and of his former employee Harwell Harris, and then something about the former employees of Neutra and how they too exemplify those 8 points. We'll talk about how through his book, Survival Through Design, my father went beyond simply accepting design tactics as an end in themselves and tried to think of what their consequences would be. And we'll finish up with the goals of the Neutra Institute for Survival Through Design. So what were they rebelling against? Wright tells us, the buildings standing then were all tall and all tight. Chimneys were lean and taller still, sooty fingers threatening the sky. Dormers were elaborate devices, cunning little buildings, complete in themselves, stuck to the main roof. So on the 8 points, which were in the Wasmuth Portfolio, I'm handling here the copy that belonged to Lloyd Wright, which is now at the Getty Institute, with these wonderful lithographs adapted from Marion Mahoney's drawings. The open plan, a horizontal relationship to the site and to nature, exploding the box, no basement, windows as screens, not holes, materials as ornament, straight lines of the machine, mechanical systems integrated into design, and linear built-in furniture. My father was able to work with Wright in the early 1920s, and you can see him there with his chin in his hand. Wright and Olgivanna, the Tsuchura couple, Werner Moser playing the violin, and my mother Diona playing the cello. She was more than simply a companion to my father, but ultimately was his executive secretary, his in charge of all photographs and relations with journals, oversaw the secretaries, and was a person that he relied on deeply in thinking about the direction of his career. They were invited to stay with Schindler in early 1925, and when they arrived at the King's Road house of 1922, they were exposed to a kind of modernism that was really amazingly radical compared to what had been done before and by others, with this functional relationship to the outdoors, here with the Pueblo Rivera apartment house of 1923, with the sliding glass doors. And this deeply influenced my father. My father was very busy between 1923 and 1930 with unbuilt projects, built projects, and writings. With Schindler, he presented this project for the League of Nations competition, which was featured in a Werkbund exhibition throughout Germany. He and Schindler designed this reinforced concrete garden apartment house. He did projects for city planning, and this reinforced steel prefabricated school for children with open doors to the outside, and influenced his thinking. Then when he was given the assignment to build this building for the man who had really influenced both Schindler and my father, it not only had a house, a swimming pool, but it also had facilities to have an outdoor school. And that school ran for about 8 years after the building was built. In fact, we heard more about it from the surviving child, who has now died, but just a few years ago. This was the youngest son who remembers what they did with the spaces there, that they could look out underneath the car setting. There were pools for the children, weaving, gymnastics, all kinds of arts and crafts that were done at this school and influenced my father's subsequent school design. I'm sitting in front of one designed after the Great Long Beach earthquake in 1936. And then he had been writing about America, how the American building and designing enterprise was conducted, and this was published in 1927. So why did my father want to be inexpensive in light, that is, cheap and thin? He was deeply influenced by Victor Adler, Dr. Victor Adler, the head of the Viennese Communist and Socialist Party. And he wanted to focus on this neglected clientele, which were present both in Vienna and all cities of the capitalist world, the slums. He wanted to use industrialization and prefabrication to address housing needs, school needs, clinics, hospitals, libraries, community centers, and the rest. And he thought that the techniques that Henry Ford had done to make cars affordable could also be done to make all these different housing types affordable. Frank Lloyd Wright himself had been thinking about prefabrication with the help of Schindler, who was working with him at that time. He proposed this prefabricated school, which really only got designed towards the end of my father's career in the Central Valley at the Lemoore Air Force Station. And then he wanted to show how prefabrication of structural elements could quickly be assembled, and demonstrated that in his first great house, the Lovell Health House, which has just now been bought for $8.5 million and is in the process of being restored. He also used prefabricated elements at his own house on Silver Lake, and similar ones at the Werkbundsiedlung in 1932 in Vienna. Experimented with steel panels in the early 30s. And in a variety of construction techniques for this school, the Corona Avenue School. Or with this steel and plywood house that was done in the mid-30s and moved from its demonstration place to where it has lived as the home of Fanny Bryce's son, William Bryce, professor of art at UCLA, and has recently been bought and restored. Continuing on with these prefabricated 300 units outside of Dallas, Texas, which still serves as a cooperative and is inherited by the descendants today of the people who originally lived there, who were airplane factory workers. And then these projects in reinforced concrete in the island of Puerto Rico in the early 1940s, schools and health centers, which were published in a Brazilian book, Arquitectura Social, in países de clima quente, in warm, mild climates. And this influenced people all over Latin America. with these kinds of reinforced concrete structures, which now we can see all over in standardized schools in Mexico, designed by the architect Artigas early on in his career. So at the end of or at the beginning rather of 1930, when the Lovell Health House was completed and the Depression was well underway, my father made a round the world tour that ended up being invited to Holland, where he saw all these different projects. In Japan, he was lectured all over Japan, then continued by boat through the Suez Canal to Europe. And he received an invitation from this man, Kees van der Leeuw, who he didn't know who he was. He thought he was a journalist. But when he came down the stairs in Basel, Switzerland, where they agreed to meet, he discovered that no, he was a very important Dutch industrialist. He had been a member of the Theosophical Society and had devoted himself to the working environment. And he was in Basel because he was on the way to the League of Nations to head a committee on suitable working conditions. But he had been influenced by Berlage, who had visited the United States in 1910 and seen Frank Lloyd Wright's work and that of the Prairie architects, and came back to talk about them in Holland. And one of the people who was influenced was Van Hoff's house in 1919, which you can see today, and the influence of Wright in the Prairie style. Dijker and Bijvoet's Kaidoon project, where you can see the Wright influence. The famous Rietveld house and the Van der Vlucht Theosophical Temple in Amsterdam, all showing the impact of Wright. Dijker's Zonnestraal Sanitarium, and his open-air school, all of which my father visited at the time. So he was seeing how the Wright that he had admired as a student, how it could be translated into modern technology. Van der Vlucht's Van der Leeuw house, and of course the famous Vanille factory. So my father then returned to Los Angeles and gradually began to receive commissions and apply Wright's 8 design tactics to his own work. So with regard to the open plan, here we have the Roby House, and here we have the Lovell Health House with its open plan. Van der Leeuw in 1931 visited Los Angeles, and because he shared my father's ergonomic interests, the physiology of perception, architecture and health, the importance of program, they really hit it off. And Kees went on to get an MD and then a psychoanalysis with Freud in Vienna, and left his job as supervisor of the Vanille factory. But after his visit of seeing the health house and seeing Schindler's work, at the end of the day, my father was dropping him off at the hotel, and Van der Leeuw said, "But why have you not shown me your house?" And my father said, "Well, I just rent a bungalow. I can't afford to build my own house." And Van der Leeuw reached into his pocket, pulled out a checkbook, and said, "How much do you need?" And my father stammered and finally agreed to take a standard interest loan of $8,000, which was about half the median house price at that time. And it took him another decade to pay that back to Van der Leeuw, but no bank would give him a loan for the kind of house he wanted to build. And this is it, the 1932 VDL Studio and Residences. He built it 2 stories because he wanted to have the view of the lake on the other side of Silver Lake Boulevard. And so it's extremely compact on a 60 by 70 foot lot, built almost like a yacht, so that here is a folding door that opens to a sleeping porch and to a ladder that goes to a roof garden. There's a place for a piano and a space for my mother's cello, and a sliding curtain that allows a person to sleep on these couches here. And here you can see this folding door. It's actually a standard folding door from a gas station. And here's a rare photograph of how it looked in its maturity, because this wing burned down in 1963. So my parents would often sleep on these couches here that could be moved around. And this notion of sliding doors going to outdoor spaces, even on second-story structures, such as the Kuhn Electric House of the mid-1930s, or the Kelton Apartments of 1941, made indoor-outdoor use. And finally, of course, with the Kaufman Desert House, where an unusual configuration of sliding doors that close together at a corner open up to the heated or cooled deck of the swimming pool. Then the horizontal hug of nature, so characteristic of Wright's work, converted into a full nature-near design on the part of my father, inspired by Wright, inspired by his training with landscape architect Gustav Amann in Zurich, and that his architectural designs included landscape design from the beginning, capturing the Japanese shake and tsuboniwa, the near and distant vistas. So we start here with the Luckenwalde cemetery. You can see the Wright influence there to the gatehouse. And my father selected all the vegetation and had a whole plan for the restoration of short-lived plants as the cemetery aged. Another characteristic of his early publications, which differentiate him from many of the illustrations from the early 30s in the architectural magazines, is the exposure of the photograph to show the nature outside of the structure. So here is my mother sitting looking out over Silver Lake. And in the 1939 wing of the VDL, looking into an intimate patio through an enormous sliding glass door that opens up to it. Or this house in Pennsylvania, the lovely, tiny little Constant Perkins house with no distant view, but this intimate view of shrubbery with a curvilinear reflection pool that snakes under the glass window into the interior of the house. Or more spectacular sites like this one near Mount Whitney in Lone Pine, California. These are the clients, Mr. and Mrs. Euler, and Mr. Euler physically built this house himself outside of Lone Pine, a post and beam design with these wonderful boulders outside and the White Mountains to the other side. The Kaufman House in Palm Springs, the Tremaine House in Santa Barbara, the Chewy House on the hill looking over Hollywood, the beautiful house in Ojai, California. Now, in photographs of Wright's buildings, you see that there's a lot of exciting things going on inside, and the windows are there, but kind of the main property is what's going on inside. Not so characteristic of my father's work. And here again, the beautiful Walker House in Carmel, where the zigzag mullions and the interesting roof overpower the landscape outside. The Villa Savoy, you see the placement of the windows quite far down from the ceiling. And even when they go to the ceiling, the main players are the wonderful Le Corbusier ramp, not so much nature. And the Villa Jeanneret Rochelle of 1922. So you compare this with the Lovell Health House, where the inside is subdued and the major player is nature outside. Exploding the box. Here is the Gale House again, with a series of horizontal and vertical planes, as opposed to a box with little holes punched into it. The Roby House, a similar thing. The Wright Unitarian Temple. And here is the Neutra Lovell House, cubic but exploding the box, and the VDL 1932 Studio and Residences, which burned in 1963 and became even more an explosion of the box, with a ramp and a spiral staircase extending out and balconies over the inner courtyard. The Schiaboretti House of the late 30s, this wonderful house in Brownsville, Texas. And then finally, the last house in 1969 outside of Lille, France. Then windows are screens, not holes. So we certainly see that with the Lovell Health House. You can see how important the intrusion of light into the interior of the building is. And at the VDL Studio and Residency, similarly, you have near views and distant views. The Beard House, the metal panel house in Pasadena in the mid or to early 30s, where you were that's not what I wanted to do. You see masonite, you see metal of different kinds, linoleum and other modern materials celebrated. This house looks over the Jungfrau in Switzerland. And finally, again, the Delcourt House, the last house, the bedroom, looking out upon a deck and a rooftop water feature with the spider leg leading the eye out to the near view of the shrubbery outside. With Le Corbusier, windows are more holes punched into the cubic forms. And so that is a different approach with the windows that stems from Wright. The ornamental potential of materials in the straight line of the machine, the integration of elements, we see it with Wright's beautiful Roby House. The pattern of the framing is integral here. The texture blocks of the Freeman House in Hollywood. Also, Adolf Loos used materials in this way, where the materials themselves were the decoration. Here with the Beard House again, and that masonite and aluminum and linoleum and steel being celebrated as materials. And the use of chrome-plated accent points. By the time we get to the Kaufman House, we're now having fieldstone, a variety of woods, terrazzo, and materials. The mechanical systems integrated into the design. Here we see it with Wright's Japanese girls' school outside of Tokyo with the lights and the auditorium, the Unitarian temple. Otto Wagner, who also was a mentor to my father, used these wonderful aluminum heating vents in the postal bank of 1915 in Vienna. So with my father, early on, you had a gutter, then you had a groove for a roll-down awning, then you had strip lighting integrated into the overhang, and then you had a breather that allowed this quasi-flat roof plenum to be ventilated and for the hot air to circulate out of it. And these roll-down awnings would either roll down when the sun was shining. This one is a house outside of Death Valley with an eastern exposure, so all during the morning these are rolled down, and then when the sun goes overhead they get rolled up again. And the strip lighting, this shows the details on the Miller house in Palm Springs, but then they're covered with a frosted glass to have a linear light element outside the building, which usually would reflect on the windows and allow the person to see outside the windows at night. Another mechanical feature that was introduced in the late 40s resulted from this visit to the architecture of the architect Hardoy and his colleague. These were wooden rotating and sliding louvers that moved with the sun. And when my father returned to the United States, he wrote an article about sun control devices that he'd seen on his State Department trip through South America. And he adapted these particular kind of vertical louvers, not only to control the sun, but also to control the strong winds that came down out of the San Gregorian Mountains onto Palm Springs, so that these could be locked in place. He used these louvers again in a gigantic form at the Los Angeles Hall of Records. And on the other side of the building had vertical fins which prevented side light from glaring into the interior of the offices. He used those large louvers again on the second version of the VDL studio in residences. And another feature that he used was water on the roof, which would evaporate and cool the roof, but also, as you can see, link to Silver Lake and reflect ripples, constantly moving ripples onto the ceiling. A built-in linear furniture of Wright is one of his Usonian houses in New Hampshire, and you can see it again in the Lovell Health House in the VDL, and you can see at night now how this night illumination worked. VDL again, the Miller house in Palm Springs, the second version of the VDL. And here you can see the Japanese distant vista and the close vistas all being carefully screened so that you see them and don't see the little roof of the neighbor next door. The built-ins also were functional. Here we're having a pass-through in the VDL2 from the kitchen to the living room. And one of my favorite rooms in the house is this little room, which was actually my mother's bedroom, with filing shelves below the bed, a floor-to-ceiling window looking out into a reflection pool, and a little parapet wall that makes it private. It's a little bit like designing an Airstream trailer, a place for everything in these tiny spaces. Schindler, of course, also was a big devotee of built-in furniture. Not so much Le Corbusier at Villa Savoye, or Alvar Aalto in his house, or the Maison de Verre, or the Gropius house in Lincoln, Mass., where the furniture is freestanding, and the Tugendhat Villa in Brno, or Elliot Noyes' house in Connecticut, or the Glass House in Connecticut. In the mid 1930s, my father started moving away from the white parapet walls and silver paint and metal to using wood. And of course, the precedent was once again Wright with his 1913 Booth Cottage, Harwell Harris's early 30s building. And around the time that the Usonians started, my father started using redwood exteriors. These are Usonian houses. Neutra Mackintosh house, the Nesbitt house of the early 40s with the pool snaking underneath the grass in the entry, plywood and redwood. The exterior was all oiled redwood, but a recent owner painted it green, unfortunately. And there's a funny story about this house. This has enormous sliding glass doors. And as was my father's wont, sometime after Nesbitt sold it to another owner, he showed up one afternoon and found that he was crashing a big party, and people were going in and out this door into the garden. And he said, "Why don't you open the sliding glass door?" And the owner looked at him sort of puzzled, and my father simply pulled the pin and slid open this entire wall, much to the delight of all the guests, who began singing a popular song of the 1950s, "Open the door, Richard, open the door and let me in. Open the door, Richard, open that door and let me in." So this was a big hit with the new owner to discover how to use his house. Another house in Connecticut, the Reunion House of 1950 that the Neutra Institute has inherited, where my brother lived for nearly half a century. This house outside of Pennsylvania. My father even deigned to do pitched roofs when he was forced to do it by local covenants. This is a lovely house in Long Beach. And one of my favorite houses in the Neutra colony, the O'Hara residence. This is a house in a development outside of Hamburg that was sort of an Eichler-like community. And this is a house in Switzerland. The experiments with reinforced concrete in 1940 in Puerto Rico suggested this post and beam kind of structure, which was used, of course, on the Tremaine house, but also began being used in wood. And this is the Leddy house in Bakersfield. And Pat Levy, who was a Mills College trained dancer, but a native of Bakersfield, she and her lawyer husband actually built this house themselves, just like the Oilers did. And here she is in her old age, still living in her house there. Towards the end of the Neutra practice, clients would be shown photographs of different kinds of materiality so that they could have this more international style approach, or the Pat Leddy post and beam approach, or even this log cabin style house from Montana that my father built. So The same 8 points show up in Neutra's former employees, Harwell Harris and Gregory Ain. Here is a project by Gregory Ain in Santa Monica, the lovely Havens House by Harwell Harris in Berkeley. Joseph Allen Stein designed many houses in Northern California and then moved on with my father's recommendation to a position in India and made a very important career in India. Rafael Soriano built many beautiful houses. Donald Wexler in Palm Springs. So the same 8 points show up again and again. Thank you, Mr. Wright. Now, in the late 30s, my father began asking himself the why of these design tactics. It's not enough to say, I like this, but to what end do I do these things? And he started returning to reading environmental psychology and physiology, which he had done as a student reading Wilhelm Wundt's book, Physiological Psychology. And so he began writing essays. In the early 40s, he was invited to teach courses at Bennington College, and that gave him time to do some more writing. But it was really only until 1953 that he found a publisher to publish it, the Oxford University Press. And the Neutra Institute is going to be reissuing Survival Through Design with a illustrated version, illustrating some of the ideas. And essentially what he was saying is that there's a causal chain. There's a design tactic, and this produces a desired parade of conscious and unconscious perceptions. And I use the word parade advisedly, that this scrolls out over time. And these perceptions have physiological results, and they have desired emotional responses to these perceptions and to this physiology, and it may even have an impact on task performance and on health. As an example, which I take from the recent book by architect Lisa Heschang entitled Visual Delight in Architecture, we take the tactic of bringing daylight and views into schools or offices or homes. So the parade of conscious, you've seen the design tactics, right? I've shown you the illustrations of how the light and how the views were brought into the interior of the structure. So the parade of conscious and unconscious perceptions are much brighter light than artificial light, a full spectrum of colors in the light, an intensity and spectrum changes that change minute to minute as the sun goes behind the clouds, and then over the course of the day as the sun rises and sets. The large windows or skylights mimic the broad light source of the bright sky, and there's less glare. And if there's views, you have an intermittent shift from focused learning, which has one kind of electroencephalogram, to a kind of view daydreaming, which has another kind of electroencephalogram. So this is the parade of conscious and unconscious perceptions. And there are physiological results to them. The circadian hormones cycle is triggered by the change of quality and intensity of light from sunrise to sunset. We don't know why it is that this is so pleasurable, but there's got to be a physiology that we don't yet understand that correlates with that pleasure. And the focused and the daydreamy kind of experience has a different electroencephalogram. When you survey teachers or people who work in these environments, you find that they prefer them strongly to artificial light. And the impact on function and health is demonstrated. This circadian rhythm is triggered and becomes stronger with these kinds of exposures. And there are all kinds of well-identified health implications of this through epidemiological study. And then the natural light has been shown to improve test scores in well-controlled epidemiological studies. So the design tactic triggers a parade of conscious and unconscious perceptions. These have physiological results and desired emotional responses, and sometimes they have actual impact on performance and health. And so this kind of natural light environment, as opposed to an artificial one, has impacts. And when is a design tactic a necessity and when is it an amenity? Well, if it has an impact on task performance and health, it's a necessity. And it has been an uphill fight to get people to recognize that the access to views is not an amenity, it's a necessity. And if it doesn't have any health impact or task impact, then I suppose it's an amenity. And if it's harmful to health, then of course it needs to be avoided. My brother Dion continued the practice after my father's death in 1970, and one of his most wonderful projects was this library in Huntington Beach, California, with nature brought inside, both with the windows and interior plantings. There's my brother giving a tour to my wife Peggy and his wife Lynn a decade ago. And on his death in 2019, my brother made a major bequest to the Neutra Institute for Survival Through Design. He bequeathed 3 buildings. One of them is this triplex in the Silver Lake area with these wonderful near views and distant views. The 1950 reunion house, which was designed by my father to accommodate grandparents separated by a big living room, and then children and grandchildren who would come for a reunion. And the building anticipated that there would be an apartment above the garage. Here's my father when he lived actually in this house for a few years after the VDL fire in 1963. You can see the classic spider leg extending the eye out beyond the envelope of the building. And here is how the living room looks, separating the wing where the parents, grandparents live and where the parents and grandchildren visit. And here is the apartment above the garage that my brother designed in the early 1980s. Then the historic Neutra Alexander office and residences has a what used to be a large drafting room has been used as an art venue for the last few years. And in the back are these 2 spaces that have been used alternately as commercial spaces or apartments. So the Neutra Institute for Survival Through Design has inherited these 3 properties and a substantial number of stocks and bonds from my brother. So our vision is where we should be, is surviving in the climate crisis through well-researched designs that serve humanity and the planet. And our mission is preserving and using the Neutra legacy to promote creative research and designs that benefit people and the planet. So on the preserving side, we have landmarked 2 of our buildings, and we'll landmark Dion's building when it reaches the age in a few years for that. We're in the process of restoring and maintaining them. We're supporting a finding aid for the Dion and Neutra papers at Cal Poly. We are early next year issuing a new illustrated edition of Survival Through Design. And we have supported the publication of Professor Ettinger's Neutra in Latin America, which will be, actually, there'll be a book signing at the VDL Studio Residence in the mid-November. Then, using the Neutra legacy to promote research in responsible design, we're programming these 3 buildings as apartment museums with neuroscience lessons. Now, these apartments are all occupied, but every once in a while they become vacant, and when they are, we do short video tours that illustrate some neuroscience lesson, and then a longer video tour that tells something about the design and the history. And then there will be a Matterport virtual walkthrough that the person with a smartphone or with their laptop can just wander through the apartment after having seen the instructional videos. And we are partnering with the Perkins-Eastman environmental psychologists from the Perkins-Eastman firm and the UCLA researchers at the UCLA Lab School to do a post-occupancy evaluation of this 1958 UCLA laboratory school. So we're preserving this legacy, but we are also trying to use this legacy to promote research and responsible design. And for those of you who are interested, you can see our website with some webinars and other information that you may find interesting, including some recordings of my father and more recently of an actress reading one of the introduction to a posthumously published book that he did. So there's a lot there to see, and with that I will stop and answer questions.
Thank you so much for this insightful and personal account on your parents' relationship with Wright. I would like to extend an invitation to everyone in the audience to type their questions in the Q&A box. We have several questions for you, Dr. Neutra, but I'd like to give some time to our participants to submit their questions. So I'll go ahead and pose the first one. The relationship that your parents established with Wright was very long-lasting, 40 years. Your mother played a major role in that relationship, in maintaining and growing that relationship, which seems pretty unique, given the fact that Wright was pretty self-sufficient, as we all know. So I wonder if there was any sort of reciprocity in terms of professional influence. We're talking about the influence of Wright on Neutra, but I wonder if throughout those 4 decades of relationship, Wright got something from Neutra, and what those things could be.
Yeah, I think, of course, Wright was not a person who had acknowledged anybody but Louis Sullivan, and then it wasn't so clear what that relationship was. There's, so by the time my father arrived in Taliesin, Wright had moved away from the Prairie House 8 points and was doing much more curvilinear and complicated things. And you could argue that the challenge from my father might have influenced the Usonian houses and falling water. That it jolted him back to his early years, which was of course more practical for economic building. And there are people who have argued that, and it seems reasonable to me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. We have some questions from the audience coming in. We have a question from Alvin Rosenbaum, who is the author of Usonia, published by Wiley in 1993. He said, my impression is that Frank Lloyd Wright subscribed to all the German language architectural magazines and had Richard Neutra translate selected articles when he was at Taliesin, creating a loop of influence with the international school. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's true. And my father was, as is well known, was very good at promoting things. And during his time with Wright, a publisher, I think his name was De Vries, wanted to do an article, and my father suggested, well, why don't you do a whole book? And he worked hard to make that possible, which was published with colored illustrations of Wright's, many of Wright's unbuilt work of the early 20s. Of course, he was there when Mendelssohn visited Taliesin, and apparently the two men were wont to have some barbs in the way they talked, and my father was translating between the two of them and carefully sort of not doing the barbs thing, so that there was a warmer relationship between Mendelssohn and Wright as a result of that intervention.
Wonderful. We have another question from Karen Mulder, who's inquiring about the influence of Neutra and John Lautner. There's also a question by Peter Maunu, who also has a question about the influence of Neutra in Mies.
My father was in 1930 in Berlin and lectured, showing his health house and so forth, and Mies was in the audience, and Mies then invited him to come and spend a week or two, I think, teaching at the Bauhaus, which Mies was then in charge of. The relationship was always cordial, both with Gropius and with Mies. As a young doctor, I had an opportunity to have lunch with Gropius a few months before he died, and also had a chance to visit Mies in Chicago. I called up and said, I'm Richard Neutra's son. I'd like to convey my father's greetings to you. And I got in and got a chance to talk to these men. It's hard to say how Mies would have been influenced by my father. There's some similarities formally, particularly in the early Mies. Lautner, it's hard to say that both Schindler and Neutra showed a more extreme indoor-outdoor connection than Wright had, and I think that Lautner may have seen that or come to it on his own.
There is a question from Gary Strang, who inquires about the relationship between Loos and Wagner in Vienna and the influence that each of them had on your father. That's a big question.
So, as a teenager, my father was watching the struggles of Wagner, and there was a point where he was going to design a museum, and there was a whole erection of a scale model thing that never came to anything. And of course, he rode the subway and saw all of Wagner's work there, but he was a little too young to be able to study with Wagner, while Schindler did study with Wagner. But both Schindler and Neutra attended night classes with Lohse and were quite close to him. And allegedly, one of his wives commented that when he found out that my dad was finally getting to America, he was very happy for that, because Lohse had been in America in the late 90s, in the late 90s, 1890s, and was very admiring of the Americans and amazed by how all these European immigrants who were fighting each other in Europe were able to cooperate and do things together once they got to America. So my father wrote quite a bit about Lohse and his memories about it in his autobiography, and compared them to Louis Sullivan.
There is another question about the influence of your father's architecture on his clients. Constance Perkins, Rita Euler, Patricia Leddy, for example. How were their lives transformed by their long-lasting relationships and friendships with your father and his projects for them?
Yeah. Well, I think like anybody, there's chemistry that occurs between people. I would say that Constance Perkins was a professor of art and a very sophisticated person. Pat Leddy was pretty sophisticated, a dancer educated at Mills College. Richard Euler was a high school graduate. But he had close relations and warm relations with them, as he did with Josephine Chuy too. I guess it speaks to what the main feature of these buildings were, which was this connection with nature, which meant that if you loved nature, then you could appreciate that architecture. Someone like Edgar Kaufman, who was a very sophisticated person, had a more he was sort of like a trophy, his trophy architect, as opposed to his lover.
And there is the last question, because we are already over the hour, but I want to pose this one. What were the influences or lessons learned from Erich Mendelsohn on your father? I know that he had a very different approach to architecture, and he believed in lighter constructions and less perhaps formal prepositions. So if you could expand a little bit on that, it'd be great.
My father never admitted any influence by Mendelssohn. He, in his letters to my mother, he says, he's an artist, architect, but it's not. This isn't like Wright. He doesn't inspire me like Wright does. And there's an interesting letter in my mother's book of letters where she is looking at some drawings of something from the Mendelssohn office and saying, oh, this is interesting. Mendelssohn is sort of branching out a little bit here. And then she discovered that, in fact, it was my father trying to design like Mendelssohn, but some Neutra is creeping in nonetheless. And this is, I think, a really interesting an interesting topic. One of my dad's most loyal co-workers was John Blanton. And John went on to have his own career, and he very explicitly chose not to use any of the Neutra details and things, although the spirit was the same there. And he was able to, when he was designing like my father, still there is something special about it. That if you know which was the lead architect that worked with my father on different projects, you can see the difference. And I usually like John Blanton's projects the most. So Wright talks about being the master's pencil, working with Louis Sullivan. And so how does the proclivities of the designer creep in, even though they are working with trying to imitate and do like the boss does it usually?
Thank you so very much. Everyone in the Q&A box is thanking you, Dr. Neutra, for this splendid presentation, and so am I. Thank you for your time in sharing all these stories and that push forward the research and the scholarship on Richard Neutra even further. I thank everyone who's been in attendance tonight for your time as well, and we'll see you soon in our next series of lectures, of Kitchell lectures. Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.